So let's look at a Heideggerian interpretation of the presentation given by Orrin McIntyre on the essence of time according to the Nick Land version. So I'm just going primarily on the presentation Orrin McIntyre gave, and not on any special knowledge of Nick Land himself. So this presentation showed time in the light of entropy and understood as a cybernetic process. The simple version of cybernetic is given in a guided missile where there's feedback between the missile and its CPU and something external to it. It's called usually negative feedback loop. It realized in the case of the missile, it's the sonar lets it know that it's out of sync with the target, and so then it says negative, I'm not facing in the right direction, and then it starts to, and then it makes a change. All, of course, completely through physical reaction in sound, through its receptivity to sound waves bouncing off back and forth, which are, of course, very small sort of physical particle interactions in a certain sense. So which is to say, everything we're talking about when we talk about the cybernetic can happen, it seems, totally independently of human beings. It's all, the cybernetic means something happening on its own, involving complex sort of outside inside, in the sense that the CPU would be the inside, or the missile in somewhat different essence would be, I mean, we don't have to understand the missile as having some kind of brain or center. We could just understand it as a missile. But the missile would be taking cognizance, in a certain sense, of the outside. I believe, to the extent, so yeah, in one sense, it's hard to judge to what extent one can be accused of anthropomorphizing the so-called missile, because we, the human beings, also, aside from however else we take cognizance of things so-called outside ourselves, we also do that by sound, just as the missile would. Only it has a very specific kind of click thing where when it gets that negative feedback, it just clicks into position, and according to a limited range of choices. If you say the human being is limited, then so do we. Maybe so that gives the sort of worry to the power of the Lockean, Hayekian version to understand the human being totally, although it's mitigated by the fact of the access in the sense of the is quality something that's not available to everyone, in the sense that some people see in black and white, some people see in color, and many other such differences which would be dependent on physical factors, which would be in a certain way exclusionary. If you didn't have those physical factors, you wouldn't be able to understand what they're about and wouldn't be able to respond to them. He shows, so let's go back to the Nick Land as showing his essence of time according to entropy, and entropy getting shown by this cybernetic feedback loop, whether negative or positive. And then I think what shows a decisive limit in his thinking which makes him boring. Although, as we could see, is very useful for teaching purposes, but he's not useful for actually reaching the real problems. And the reason I claim is because he doesn't enter into the question of how the goals, which is the question of all of Nietzsche, every page of Nietzsche is thinking of this already, and Nick Land never says one word about it. Is the goals, is the laws of the table of values. So, for instance, this is so let's look at how Leo Strauss addresses this. So one version of the way Nick Land is understanding entropy is by this unscientific way of understanding it, which is given in the popular versions, which is to say it's more complex to have a garden which has been gardened by a gardener and produced as something like a botanic garden than it is to have the thing run riot and the weeds grow. But as soon as we ask what distinguishes a weed from a proper plant, then we get into all the problems of nous and all the problems of Aristotle and the classical tradition, which are alien to the tradition that produced the idea of entropy. So it's interesting to understand Nick Land as doing a kind of Jungian move and just sort of saying, look, this limit of the empirical version of entropy jumps up against this noumenal version, or the command version, the religious version. And the religious command says, this is the garden as it should be, the botanic garden, it's beautiful. This is the weed, this is the overgrown garden, it must be destroyed. So that's like the religious version of his version of entropy. The actual version of entropy is to just look at particles, where what's really being said is when the particles get in a sort of, to speak a little bit like Richard Feynman, and just use like a 1950s vernacular to say they're sort of in a sloppy state and they can't produce any complex structures. They're not like, they can't direct force in a way that's complex in the sense that a sonar system or a AI system is directing actuality, actual force, electricity, physical force, mechanical force, in complex ways. They're in a slop. That's the maximum state of the so-called heat death. They can't produce activity or force in the sense of the concept of entropy understood as a strictly physical concept, and not understood in the sense, in the pseudo sense of the way entropy is very often, almost most often, presented, which is a false sense from the scientific point of view, as the garden against the, as your room, for instance, in the Peterson version. The messy room versus the cleaned up room. So, I mean, just think about it. Is the messy room less complex than the cleaned up room? I mean, think about it neutrally. Isn't it even obvious from just a direct neutral reflection that this is just a silly statement? It doesn't really make sense. It's the real sense of it is, can it produce physical force in a complex way that's predictable? That's the real sense of the theory of entropy, and that things are constantly, if there's not an influx into the system constantly, like light coming down to the earth, then things tend to go towards this sort of Richard Feynman sloppy sense. Just slop, not edible hardly, not even steak, like in the Matrix, where the Ralphie character chooses the Matrix version over the algorithmic version, not to say, where I think in the algorithmic version, when you take the red pill, then you're sort of eating the, not the real hemoglobin steak, but the Beyond Meats version or something. So I would say Nick Land kind of conflates the popular. So that's the question. Does he? let's give him the benefit of the doubt and say that he fuses rather than merely confuses these two versions of entropy, so that he takes the popular stupid presentation, which has nothing to do with the way scientists operate, but he allows it to be part of his theory of time, which makes a considerable amount of sense when you think about the human environment in terms of memes. Then this concept of memes very readily shows itself to be untenable, and we see that the meme is a thought, or it's something like this, like what I'm now saying. If you take it seriously, then you hone into it, you attend to it, and you might even take actions based on it. So it's part of the environment. So our thoughts are obviously part of the environment, but then the meme is supposed to be something said as only part of the environment, but not part of the genetics instructions that are telling our body how to form itself. Yeah, there's a certain level at which you can hold to that distinction, but then you have to see. Then you just get the version of that we're self-reading ourselves by our culture, however conceived. But on the other hand, I think there's the more powerful version here is to say the whole theory of the genetics and the giving orders according to the cybernetic essence ultimately has to give way as has something that, even though it is something that can help us make certain predictions and understand certain things, we don't have to have it as an E-day fix. We don't have to only have this as the highest table of the values. We don't have to only regard things as happening according to this way, but it's not obviously such a dominant good, such a guide, such a Dulphine, such a Heidegger Dulphine, that it should be simply the guide of Apollo, simply that which directs, that which helps us, yea say and nay say. But in any case, I think, land by understanding time according to entropy and the cybernetic essence and all this stuff. This is as though he simply sidestepped and didn't even look at the notions of Hegel, who has understood the quantity passing into quality as the basis of time, or the reverse as given by Bergson, or then the treatment given by Heidegger, which has seen these attempts thoroughly, and then stepped into the Seinfrage according to the question of this sort of heavy Teutonic thinker who has inspired Heidegger in some way, Brentano, who has suggested to another look at Aristotle's questions about how being is said in many ways. I think on the whole, it's interesting to look at Nick Land's sort of cybernetic clock of time he's presenting, but only on sort of the full level of a theory of analytic science, just because it helps us to see how unfitting, how out of joint it is. How it doesn't give us what we need, but it does by looking at its stupidity, or its whimsy, I should say, because it's sort of uplifting in a way. We do see something that draws our attention to kind of the general area, and part of the general area is that this connection I'm making. So let's just state it that way, is to say, as soon as we have the problem of saying the garden is better than the overgrown garden, we have the question of where Nietzsche comes in, and where the Aufklärung version is contesting the old version, and Land sort of naively steps in right at this point, and it's like he doesn't know that Nietzsche has like thoroughly looked at that. He doesn't know that Max Weber has come in and sanitized the situation with some help from Simmel. He doesn't know this has come in and exactly has it taken over our economics through Frank Knight and through other channels. And it's just, and he doesn't know Leo Strauss. He doesn't understand Leo Strauss. He doesn't understand Alexander Dugin. He's just like as though he were his. He's out of sync and like way behind, like centuries behind. And it's sort of it's there's we get something by looking at it and then showing sort of why it's so far out of sync, I guess. Is that we could only use this as a stepping stone to get closer to where Heidegger is.